much, please. Please be seated.
Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Oriol Marti will defend the academic thesis, Essays on the Structure of Supply and Demand. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis. The floor is yours.
Dear Prorector, dear members of the Corona, dear friends and family, in the following 15 minutes I will present my thesis titled Essays on the Structure of Supply and Demand. Economic growth is a complex, highly endogenous phenomenon. However, since the classical economists, there has been a generalized tendency to oversimplify economic development, portraying it as a historical unified process of capital accumulation. One perspective that has been proven useful in balancing analytical capacity and the inherent complexity of growth is the study of the composition and transformation of the structure of the economy, known as structural change. The study of structural change is present in classic economics, in development theory, and post-Keynesian and evolutionary economics. Recent years have witnessed a resurgence of interest in structural change, driven in part by the ascent of China as a global economic power and the process of the industrialization experienced in Western economies. This renewed attention has been further propelled within academia by the emergence of the economic fitness and complexity framework. However, there's still a notable tendency in the literature to overlook the role that demand plays in shaping the trajectories of structural change, leading to an incomplete understanding of the forces driving economic growth. This thesis has three main aims. The first and most general is to offer a contemporary and comprehensive study of countries' economic structure in relation to their development level. The second aim is to incorporate demand side into the formal analysis of structural change. This should not be understood merely as flows of funds, but rather as the underlying structure of consumption, investment, and other demand components. The final aim is to analyze some aspects of economic fitness and complexity from the perspective of classic development theory. Now I'm going to present chapter 2, which is called A Description of Mature and Catching Up Economies. An inherent idea in conceptual development theory is that economies at different income levels are described by different models. That is, the sources, the social groups, and the demand components driving economic change are different at different income levels. From this comes the concept of stages of development. The most famous contribution in the topic is that of Rostow, but the idea is present in the writings of authors such as Lewis or Kaldor. Stages of development contrast on the one hand with unified theories of growth, such as the neoclassical growth model and the derived models. On the other, with some aspects of fitness and complexity, especially with smart specialization, in which gains from producing goods are heterogeneous but invariant along the development path, and there are no trade-offs between the production of goods. The aim of the paper is to provide a description of the supply and demand structure characteristic of different stages of development. Regarding the methods, since the stages of development can be identified on the one hand by countries' income and growth, that is, in mature economies are characterized by low income and low growth, catching up economies by, let's say, middle income and high growth, and mature economies by high income and relatively low growth rates. And on the other hand, these stages of development are represented by the structure of supply and demand in these economies. Therefore, by linking these two dimensions, one can derive the, let's say, representative supply and demand structure of these stages of development. I use countries' exports and imports as a proxy for supply and demand, and linearly relate this to income and growth. First, reducing the dimensions of trade data using principal component analysis, and then linearly relating the two using canonical correlation analysis. Regarding the results, in catching up economies, the exports of labor-intensive manufactured goods are prominent. Imports of consumer goods are relatively unimportant, and the imports of capital, especially machinery, are very relevant. Mature economies, on the other hand, export knowledge-intensive goods, such as capital, consumer durables, and advanced intermediate products. They do not show a specialization in importing manufacturing productive capacity, but high specialization in the imports of all types of consumer goods. More generally, I find that there is some incompatibility between the structures of catching up and mature economies. For instance, textiles, which bring high growth, are incompatible with high income. On the other hand, large role of consumers over investment is characteristic of high income, but would slow down growth in catching up economies. Another interesting finding is that there are some areas of overlap. For instance, electronic and electric goods are important both in catching up and mature economies, as well as instrument and optical products. These goods can represent escape from middle-income traps and might be important for mature economies seeking higher growth. Now I'm moving to chapter 3, which is called Structural Alignment. In the theories of technological change and economic development of Adam Smith and Alan Young, there is the implicit idea that growth is associated with increasing diversity. Larger markets cause larger division of labor and more roundabout or indirect productive process, which in turn increases further the size of the economy. Also in fitness and complexity, diversity is a positive component in the algorithm. These views contrast with a paper by Ims and Warziak claiming that countries first to diversify up to a point in which they respecialize. These authors show that the relationship between income and concentration of sector shares follows an inverted U-shape. This contribution has largely been contested, but remains pretty influential in development circles. The aim of the paper is first to discuss the definitions of diversity and the aspects of productive structures associated with different indicators. The second is to describe the distribution that activities take in the course of development. In this paper, I use average exports from 2016 to 17 at 6-digit level. Regarding the results, entropy, which captures concentration of shares of economic activities, tends to show indeed respecialization at high level of income. Also, binary RCA, which defines diversity not as the absence of concentration, but as the count of product specialization, also tends to show respecialization at high levels of income. On the other hand, fitness and complexity, it's monotonically increasing with development. However, it is hard to associate whether the increasing complexity is driven by higher diversity or smaller ubiquity, or let's say a smaller average ubiquity. We show using an indicator which combines RCA and entropy that the tendency of a country's productive structure is to adapt to the structure of world demand. What this indicator shows is that a country producing all goods in proportion to demand might show higher concentration than another country which produces less but more evenly distributed. But after all, it's the economy able to do all the products, the one that has more diversity of capabilities. Rather than the distribution of activities between countries, there is a distribution of market shares. Let me go to chapter 4, which is the structure and evolution of consumption patterns. The structure of consumption demand is an important component in some theories of development. For example, Latin American structuralism, post-Keynesian models like Basinetti's, or in several evolutionary models. However, empirical studies on the structure of consumption are scarce, and the literature largely relies on Engels' study on the topic. The aim of this paper has two main aims. On the one hand, it's to determine the relationship between economic development and macroeconomic consumption patterns, and on the other, to see whether there has been changes in this relationship in time. Regarding the data used in this paper, I use on the one hand imports of consumer goods from 1988 to 2016. This data covers roughly 1,200 products. And on the other hand, I use household consumption vectors from input-output tables. Regarding the methods, I use Kullback-Leahy divergence, which is a way to assess the degree of similarity between two discrete probability distributions. Then what I do is to compare the consumption patterns of a country to the consumption patterns of G7 economies using this indicator. What this provides is an indicator of the similarity between consumption in a given country in a given year and that of G7 in this same year. The main findings of the paper are the following. First, consumption patterns are very related to income. There are no geographical or cultural differences. Second, consumption patterns have converged. That is, consumption patterns are on average more similar now than they used to be 30 years ago. Also, this convergence has occurred without a corresponding convergence in income. Finally, let me conclude by outlining some of the lessons that can be extracted from this thesis. First and generally, the study of economic development benefits from considering demand. This is an economic statement based on the importance that demand has in inducing investment, and thus the productive structure and growth. Second, the thesis shows that now capitalism is ubiquitous. The ways of living of people are homogenizing around the world. Moreover, countries are linked by supply and demand relations stronger than ever in history. This calls for analysis of economic systems that take into account interconnections. On the policy side, industrial policy should account for the incompatibilities and incentives linked with different stages of development. Regarding diversification policy, it should consider learning opportunities from production, but also market considerations. That is, in seeking diversity and higher complexity, a country shouldn't forget about large and complex sectors. Thank you for your attention. I give back the word to the prorector.
Thank you for your presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Dr. Luc Soete. Professor Soete was the chair of the assessment committee, and Professor Soete is a professor of international economic relations at this university. The floor goes to Professor Soete.
Thank you, Prorector. Dear candidate, dear Oriol, I don't know you, but reading you, it is as if I had known you for a long time. And the way in which you introduce issues which have been living around or being discussed around for a long time within development studies, and bringing back some of the old historical views as well as structural change is really refreshing. It reminds me of my own interests in economic development, and from that perspective, it reminds me also of my first PhD student here, at this university, where I offered him a bike, a tandem actually, to try to catch up with the other researchers at the institute in a sport in biking, in which he still, at this moment, is still one of the best performance of this institute and of this university, if I may say so. This was in a period long before the period you have analyzed. I'm talking here about the late 80s and the beginning of the 90s. And so my issue is really to what extent what you have analyzed, particularly in chapter 4, which I think is the most interesting in terms of highlighting the role of demand, how you could further elaborate a little bit on this issue, which I think is a fascinating conclusion, that global consumption patterns have converged without a corresponding convergence in income. And I think there I would like to push you a little bit further in terms of what has happened over that period. And I think that in there you pay relatively little attention to, beyond structural change, the issue of product differentiation. Product differentiation was something which really emerged, I think, primarily at the level of theories of monopolistic competition, but also more at the micro level, but still were translated into issues about how increased product differentiation would lead one to increased trade, in particular think of the whole areas of new trade theory, but also in terms of leading to various other imitations of development, so to say. I mean, I remember very much you make some references to the way the homogenization of demand and consumption, referring to the end of the Soviet Union and the various other reforms of the World Bank and IMF, the Chinese economic reforms, etc. But what was so characteristic for somebody having been, I traveled at the time to both Russia, Hungary, etc. before the 1990s, what was characteristic was that there was so little advertising, so little differentiation in products. We even used, in our price comparisons, we used the Lambda car as the car which was the baseline to make all kind of hedonic prices comparisons in terms of the quality improvements which were introduced in cars in the West, etc. And you each time needed to have a measure of these product quality improvements and how they would be translated into prices. So product differentiation for me is a really major issue, and you seem at least to give very little acknowledgement to that fact. So I would be curious to hear your reflections on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, esteemed opponent. So could you please repeat the question?
Yes, this is how, just not the categories of products, the identity of products. I think colleagues will elaborate on this further in the technicalities in your analysis, but the notion of product differentiation, that is suddenly you have divergence, not just in product, in services, the product variety, etc., are all features which are characteristic, particularly of the last 50 years, I would say.
Okay, so if I understood well, what you are highlighting is how, for instance, in the West, there has been a process of, let's say, product differentiation, right, that was missing in, let's say, Soviet Russia. And once these barriers of trade fell, all these countries have access to these consumer goods, right? Yeah, and indeed, I think this is a part that it's missing in the paper, since everything is framed in the context of structural change. Maybe I haven't paid enough attention to, let's say, consumer theory, a taste for variety, and so on and so forth. But also it's interesting, this part, that this process is also related to, let's say, the developmental paths of the West versus those of the Soviet Union, in the sense that there was an emphasis there with increasing productive capacity and not so much in supplying, let's say, a variety or higher quality of consumer goods. And also, yeah, what I wanted also to highlight in this paper is that we are observing now some changes in the ways of living of people. By that I'm referring specifically to urbanization and decreasing fertility rates. And this process has been happening all around the world without, let's say, convergence in income, right? In the past, urbanization used to be so linked to industrialization and so on. And now we are seeing urbanization without economic development. And I think that also these two processes lead to some sort of homogenization of consumption patterns by the constraints that you have in your ways of living. But of course, the paper would benefit more from more attention to, let's say, consumer theory and also industrial dynamics, let's call it. Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Dr. Alessandro Nuvolari, who was a member of the assessment committee and who is a professor of economic history and director of the Institute of Economics at the Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna. The floor goes to Professor Nuvolari online.
Okay, dear Oriol, sorry for being online. I've read your thesis with great interest, and it was nice to see how you move. Now you were a master student here in Pisa, and it's nice to see how you move from the post-Keynesian literature to this economic complexity and fitness type of literature, but you have still kept in the thesis this a bit of the interest in the classical literature and in this post-Keynesian motivation. So I think the thesis is really a nice piece of work. And my question deals with the policy implication arising from chapter 2 and 3. So you highlight in those chapters that in order that countries should try to converge to a pattern of specialization that is able to maximize their growth potential. And you highlight a number of structural properties of specialization patterns that are linked with growth at different levels of development. And my question then is about the policy implication that arise from this finding. And in this perspective, there is a debate about on how fast or how smooth is the process of structural change for developing countries. For example, there are authors that suggest that it is possible for a country to immediately jump to a pattern of specialization that is a higher potential in terms of growth. This was called for leapfrogging in the past. Other authors instead insist that patterns of specialization are sticky and countries need to follow a number of stages before arriving to these type of patterns. So my question is, does your thesis provide insights on that debate? So one of the people insisting on the possibility of leapfrogging was Luc Soete that is there. So does your thesis deals with this debate between people that think that new technologies allows developing countries to leapfrog and to have a faster catching up, or instead we have a much more traditional stage perspective on economic growth? Because it was not clear from the policy implication sections of the two chapters.
Thank you very much, highly esteemed opponent. Yes, indeed. I think that in my thesis, maybe there is an excessive focus on the early stage of catching up. So there is a big focus on the role that, let's say, labor-intensive manufacturers play in the role they play in development, and not so much attention in, let's say, the other stages of catching up. And in fact, I guess that my thesis shows a very smooth process, maybe unbalanced in the beginning, relying a lot on labor-intensive manufacturers, but then it sort of gives the impression that the diversity and increasing the quality of products that a country exports is going to happen naturally. Yes, indeed. I think that at the later stages of development, it's clear that a country needs to upgrade its productive structure. How to do that, whether leapfrogging or following a smooth process, I don't know. I don't know much about that. Of course, I would say leapfrogging. However, I don't have any notion right now on what would be the costs. I think that my thesis, what shows in general, is that there are trade-offs between the things you do. Okay, what is clear is that a high-income economy that it's specialized in minerals cannot go back in time, let's say, and follow again all the process of going through textiles and so on. So it is clear that the highest is the level of income of a country, irrespective of what the productive structure that they have at the time, they should move to the goods that are characteristic of the countries that are at similar level. So for instance, in smart specialization, if you would took, for instance, let's say Saudi Arabia or Chile, if you look at the density around the density in the products that Saudi Arabia or Chile could produce, I think that this could lead to misleading policy recommendations in the sense, okay, now you have to follow all the ordered process of going to textiles, cars, and so on. However, what I try to show in the thesis is that the structural characteristics of these countries, for instance, having small or no surplus labor and so on and so forth, on the one hand, it prevents them to do all this ordered process of diversity, and therefore, actually, these countries should jump directly to, let's say, high-tech products. Of course, there cannot be labor-intensive high-tech products, but can be, for instance, AI and so on and so forth. In this sense, that's why I think that the framework of steamed opponent Emanuele is relevant, because you not only see the structure of the productive capacity, but you can see the underlying structure of knowledge and so on and so forth. So for countries that have like middle and high income, but not an industrial productive structure, you can get hints there on what to do. I hope this replies your question.
Yes, I think there will be other questions in the panel touching these issues. So if it's fine.
Continued by Dr. Nandita Matthew, who was the third member of the assessment committee, and she is a postdoctoral researcher at the UNU Merit. The floor goes to Dr. Matthew.
Thank you, Oriol, for the presentation. It was a very interesting thesis, not just to read. I also had a feeling that you enjoyed writing it. This is not obvious to see. My question is on the fourth chapter, where you observe some empirical evidence for the convergence in consumption patterns. You have a result that higher openness does not lead to more similarity in imported consumption goods, which is not obvious, or I was wondering what would be the reasoning behind this result, and in general the policy conclusions or policy implications that you could derive from this chapter on reverse globalization or on other institutional setup that have been changing in the recent past. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Could you repeat, please, the second part of the question?
Yeah, so the first part of the question is that you do not find evidence that higher openness would lead was one of the factors affecting this convergence. The second part is more, what do you think about the policy implications from this chapter? Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. Yeah, regarding higher openness, I think this is, let's say, a numerical phenomenon or my poor choice of the indicator of openness. Mm-hmm. I think I use either export to GDP or trade to GDP. And of course, this is very affected by mineral exporters, which these two things are very high over GDP. And I think that in general, developing economies tend to have very high levels of, or very high ratios of trade to GDP. So the negative coefficient in openness might be due to that, because indeed, I agree with you. And in fact, it's a bit contradictory that I find maybe a negative sign, and then in the text I argue that one of the reasons that explains this fast convergence is due to higher openness. So in this sense, yeah, some work could be done in improving this. Also, regarding the specification in general, I think that in this chapter I was happy enough just to show the convergence that I observed, and that this convergence was faster than economic convergence. So if I would want, or if I had to explain the full process, I think a better specification would be also to include, let's say, the possibility of moving slope in other dimensions, right? So like there has been a more openness across countries, so I would need to check that in time also. And I didn't do it, but yeah. Now, regarding policy, frankly, it's very hard, this one, because on the one hand, we are seeing this process of, let's say, homogenization of ways of living, also culturally, we are creating, let's say, a global culture and so on. And at the same time, we are seeing the rise in trade barriers and so on. So, okay. It has clear policy implications in the sense that one of the big debates also in traditional development theory is that when a country increases income without increasing its, let's say, production capabilities and so on, income would leak outside in the means of import. What this paper might show is that these linkages might be higher now than ever. However, I don't know. Because at the same time, of course, the prices of manufacturing are going down, the price of manufacturers, and in trade, I'm only checking that. And then there is an array of more subtle policy things, like how, to what extent can, at this moment in time, stop the process of globalization. Because now we have that it's not only a political thing, but like common people, it's quite involved in that. I think that's, for instance, the backlash with the intention to forbid TikTok in the US, right? There was quite a big reaction from consumers. I hope this.
Thank you.
Answer.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Clovis Frère, who was the fourth member of the assessment committee and who is the Economic Affairs Officer on Technology and Logistics at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD. The floor goes to Dr. Freire.
Thank you, Prorector. Dear candidate, my dear Oriol, we share the same interest for economic structural change and economic dynamics. I was very interested to read your thesis, particularly because you use a different methodology. And my question will go to that. I would like to hear from you if you could elaborate a little bit more on what you see as the difference and advantage of the methodology that you have used in Chapter 2, the canonical correlation analysis, in comparison with the strand of literature on economic complexity, thickness, also product space. I saw that you mentioned that you state that you compare the structure of production with characteristics of the economy, income, and growth. But on that strand of literature, economic complexity, fitness, that line of research also exists. There is this kind of understanding to try to compare the structure of the economy with growth, for example. And actually, initial seminar papers of that literature as well with PRODI, SP, even precursors of that, Sanjaya Law in a paper in 2005 also use income to come up with an index of products, differentiate products and also economies. So what are the difference between the methodology that you use today in your thesis and those other methodologies?
Thank you so much, estimable opponent. I won't be able to say much on the PRODI and the LAL part, because I haven't reviewed that literature so well, but I will refer to, let's say, the contemporary fitness and complexity. So these algorithms are designed with a task in mind, and they do pretty well what they are intended to do, which is to find, let's say, the sophistication of a country productive structure and also the sophistication in products. Instead, the methodology I use, it does associations, right? So it's not intended to capture sophistication, but simply to associate income and growth to the production structure that you can get from import and exports. Of course, what's going to happen is that, on the one hand, the products that relate to income, you will capture their sophistication, but many other things that are not sophistication, right? For instance, you will capture, how do you say, items that get fashionable in the West with respect to other places, or products that, are characteristic of Western consumption, let's say decaf coffee. So, that's one thing, right? We will capture other things. On the other hand, there is this thing that I think that fitness and complexity struggles a bit, which is to make a link with growth. Because usually, richer economies tends to be those that are more sophisticated, but we know that the countries that grow at a higher rate are not the same as the ones that are richer. In fact, the relationship between growth and income could be better described as, let's say, decreasing or an inverted U-shape. So I think that the advantage of the methodology that just makes association is that we can also associate products to growth, right? And you get that growth, it's led by quite unsophisticated goods, but that they have very positive characteristics. And these characteristics were identified back in the days, which are like, let's say, the dynamic increasing returns, the capacity to generate lots of employment, and so on and so forth. So I think that what this shows is that, first of all, irrespective of the structure of a country, so irrespective of if a country is at the current stage producing agricultural products or mineral and so on, there is a part of the product space that might be unconnected, let's say textiles, but we know that these goods are going to drive higher growth. So, okay, to sum up in some way, I think that this, the canonical correlation analysis, what it shows is that in deciding in what products a country should specialize, it's necessary to take into account the stage of development rather than the current productive structure. Okay, another example might be Chile. So from the product space, you might arrive to the conclusion that Chile should do cable or products related to the manufacturing of copper. Instead, from our perspective, we see that these are products that are characteristics of low levels of income, not the relatively middle high income level of Chile. Yeah, it was more or less understandable, or if you want, you can follow up with a question. Or
no, thank you. Particularly dealing with growth. Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Dr. Robin Cohen, who is a professor of economics of technical change at UNIMED. The floor goes to Professor Cohen, who is online.
Thank you very much, Prorector. Dear candidate, dear Oriol, it was a real pleasure to read your thesis, I have to say. Nandita already remarked that it was obvious that you enjoyed writing it, and I appreciated that, and I appreciated the lightness with which you were able to introduce your chapters. I also appreciated very much not having to read page after page of justification for why this bizarre variable is a good instrument for that variable. So I was very happy to read something other than that kind of thing for a change. So well done on that score. I want to ask you about something that takes me back, particularly about chapters 2 and 3, explicitly not about chapter 4, because I don't think what I'm going to say applies to chapter 4. But I'm wondering whether in chapters 2 and 3 you're being tempted into the position that Simon Kuznets found himself in, where he was, you remember the Kuznets curve, where inequality increases and then decreases with development. That was his claim. And he made that claim based on cross-sectional data. And what turned out when Chenery and Taylor got a bit better data, they discovered that the Kuznets curve was not a dynamic thing, but actually a cross-section. And at that point, the middle-income countries were mostly in Latin America, which had a notoriously unequal distribution of income. So the cross-section data showed a clear inverted U, if you like, whereas it was a mistake to draw when you got enough data to look at countries over a period of time, you saw an actual U shape rather than an inverted U shape at the country level. So I'm wondering whether your chapters 2 and 3 are inviting us to make that same logical, what should we say, let's say mistake that people reading Kuznets were tempted to draw. And whether you can say something about temporal patterns rather than snapshots of what people in these, what countries in these categories look like. I'd be interested to hear whether you have thoughts along those lines.
Thank you very much, highly esteemed opponent. Yeah, this is a very good question. Actually, yeah, my analysis is quite cross-sectional. In some appendices, I try to extend the analysis for multiple periods, but still cross-section using different periods. And there, what you observe is that definitely, for instance, in the product scores that describe growth, there is much more volatility. So I think that the theoretical concept of a catching up economy should imply a stable high growth rate, and instead, with the methodology, I'm capturing what, let's say, the economies that are growing at the time are producing. So yeah, this might be an issue. Now, I would really need to think about carefully on how to do, let's say, dynamic analysis. I wouldn't know where to start, frankly. And I think that in the field of economic complexity, what it has been done in CREV, it's very relevant. Yeah. I really don't know what to say on that.
Okay, thanks.
Continue, Professor Cohen, if you still have another question.
If there's time for a second completely different question, I'll focus not on a chapter, but on a page. Page 68, in fact, you introduce Arthur Lewis and talk about the surplus labor economy that Lewis was interested in. That's in the middle of the page. And at the end of the page, you talk about the agricultural sector. Lewis treated agriculture as essentially nothing more than a source of cheap labor, Lewis and members of his people who followed him. In the 1970s and 80s, there was a big pushback that's argued, many people argued, Fayen Reynes, Jorgensen, others, that actually agriculture is a source of capital, not just cheap labor. And that to understand economic development, you have to understand that role of agriculture. And that was the reason they gave for insisting on agricultural development. You talk about essentially getting rid of agricultural imports as a reason for agricultural development. Can you shed any light on that issue from what you've done? What's the role of agriculture specifically in all of this?
Could you clarify me, when you refer to agriculture as a source of capital, what sort of capital would that be? I understand that it's not machinery, but...
Financial capital.
Financial capital. Yes, yes, indeed. That's very relevant. And yeah, I think there are many cases in history in which like initial financial capital for industrialization were first accumulated in the agricultural sector. But of course, I think that the view of the agricultural sector that Lewis has, it's not a market agricultural sector, right? But basically as the place where surplus labor goes, right? In fact, with what I was saying before, with the increasing urbanization and so on, there might indeed be a change of what is the sector that places all the surplus labor. And instead of being in agriculture, as it has traditionally been in the 20th century, we might observe now that it's personal services that are accumulating surplus labor. But yes, it can indeed be a source of financial capital, but I think that within agriculture, one should distinguish, right? The, let's say, market-oriented agriculture and, let's say, subsistence agriculture, right? I think that if one distinguishes that, there is no intrinsic problem with agriculture. In the sense...
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yep, thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Emmanuel Pugliese, who is a postdoctoral researcher at UNU Merit. The floor goes to Dr. Pugliese.
Dear candidate, I started by saying that as the other member of the commission, I really enjoyed reading your thesis. I think it connects different literatures that are very keen to me, and they connect, and the thesis connects them in a natural and effective way, and also a way that shows competence in both strains of literature. So, really, congratulations. My question is related to Luke's question, but slightly more technical. Whenever we look at the process of structural change and consumption baskets, there is a role of the classification you use to define a product. If we look today at the difference in consumption between me and my neighbor, we might have, I might have an internal combustion car, my neighbor could have an electric car, I could have a smartphone of some generation, he could have a smartphone of a different generation. And this would be captured by today's classification. This would not be captured by classification from 1960 because this product didn't exist in 1960. So this is, the lens you use to analyze the process could have an impact. Usually this is a robustness check that I would tell you to add in the appendix of the thesis. But in the specific case of your thesis might be very relevant because you're not looking at difference between neighbors, but you're looking at if there is a convergence in total. Just to make a quick example, in table 4.1, your thesis, you have that for all the database that you observe convergence in the process for the first time periods and less going on. This will be also consistent not with the fact that the convergence is slowing down, but with the fact that the classification used for the classification stays the same for all the time series, and in the beginning is able to capture difference. At the end of the process, is not able anymore to capture difference because you're looking at with the lens of 1960 to something happening in 2000. So what do you think about this? The same would be also valid for chapter 3. Are countries specializing today, or the classification used in the 60s is not able to understand the diversification that happens today because those products are not there?
Thank you very much, esteemed opponent. I think this is a very good question, and it helps me, because maybe I haven't been clear enough in the thesis. So basically what I do, I use the current classification of the time. So for the 5 periods, let's say from, or I don't know, it's from 95 to 97, I use HS 95, right? Then I use the following one and so on. So I think the phenomenon of changing products in the classification, it doesn't affect me that much, in the sense, in the 5 window period in which products are classified using the same classification, you might observe like more convergence, right? But then I run the same exercise on a yearly basis, only with trade data because it's the one that have more observations and I can do that. And the process was very smooth, right? Indeed, if like that was a relevant issue, what I would observe is that every time there is a change in classifications, right? Since new products enter, let's say electric cars and smartphones, then there would be a peak in divergence, right? And the process would be decreasing peak, decreasing peak. And luckily I didn't see that. That might also be due to the metric I use, the school-behavior divergence, that, for instance, might be driven by categories that are very important in the consumption of a country, but not in G7, right? So, for instance, if a country spends a lot on cereals and the G7 doesn't, this product has a very high weight in the indicator. So I think that small things like computers, cars, and so on, I don't think it has a great effect, but it's more these products like cereals and so on and so forth that have decreased their share a lot. However, yeah, I cannot provide a detailed insight on what has driven the metric in time. But yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will be concluding the first round, which gives us an opportunity to get into a second round. And it's a custom at this university to give those who come from further away than the first opportunity, and that is that Professor Nuvolare will get another opportunity to discuss with you some questions which he has. So the floor goes to Professor Nuvolare.
Thank you. Okay. I still focus on chapter 3, and my question would be again in comparing your approach with you carry out in this chapter a comparison between your approach and the economic complexity approach. So what I would like to do, what I would like to ask you is to elaborate on which type of additional insights does your indicator of structural alignment gives with respect to the more traditional economic fitness indicators?
Thank you. Yeah, I like this question very much. I think that, okay, this indicator, I think what it shows is that it's a continuous aggregation of RCA, right? And RCA, it's equivalent, it can be seen with the normal definition as the ratio of the share of a product in the exports of a country to the share of the product in world trade, which is the interpretation I gave as an increasing alignment with demand, but it's complete, a definition that it's equivalent, it's the one of the market share that a country has in one good divided by the total market share of the country in world trade. Then what this indicator shows is that in the course of development, and let's assume that the market share that a country has in a given product, it represents its competitiveness, right? And the market share that the country has in world trade, it's the average competitiveness. Then the fact that my indicator tends to show that it goes to zero, it means that when a country develops, it becomes competitive in everything that it produces, right? So when a country develops, it tends to maintain, let's say, high competitiveness in goods like textiles, agricultural products, and so on and so forth. And to me, this is the famous thing of economic complexity, or one of the most pretty findings, which is the nestedness. The idea that a country that is able to do the most, the less ubiquitous things, it's also able to do the whole range of other products. And the advantage that this indicator has is that it's very simple. It's very traceable what's going on there.
You may briefly conclude your reaction.
That was all.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Oriol Gisbert Marti, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed, and the degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. Now request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
All right, please.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the line, I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Take the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you won the battle once you grow. South side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile.
I don't know.
Please be seated.
Oriol Gisbert Marti, the degree committee here present, has assessed the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. And in view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Verspagen is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom, and I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
All right, please.
So, Oriol, there's one more question. Let me make sure I have the proper language. So the question is the following. Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, which means to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
I promise.
Correct answer. So then, by the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Oriol Gisbert Marti, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. And as evidence of that, I will now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university. Okay, if you want, you can put it on the stand, which is behind you. I think that's what it's intended for. So, Oriol, I'm very happy to also say a few words at the end of this very official ceremony. And that's usually looking back at your career in the Institute, your research, your trajectory. And it's actually quite a special trajectory because, at least for me, the people that I've supervised, among those, you are the first who is really somebody who's gone through the entire COVID experience. You started just a year or 2 years before that, and you sat through all of that, which was really, of course, a big change to the way that we do things. And you were one of the people who had to go through the whole Zoom experience. I think you truly became a member of this new generation of Zoom academics, ChatGPT, AI to do it, and you got the perfect answer, so that was very easy. So in that way, you're a very modern scholar. But you also, and a number of people here today already hinted at that, you're also in many ways a more traditional and old-fashioned scholar because you draw on many traditions from the past. You have worked and you're still working in a truly intellectual tradition with respect to all the finer points in the history of economic thought, the classics. You usually start a chapter, a paper with some reference to Adam Smith and some of the other classic economists. You're also firmly rooted in, let's say, the heterodoxy of the economics of innovation and new technology. You did your master thesis in Sant'Anna, Pisa, today in the committee represented by Nandita and Alessandro. But you added a little twist to that because you wrote your master thesis there on Sraffa, not exactly somebody who's often cited in this tradition, and you did it under the supervision of Neri Salvadori, also in Pisa, but representing a completely different heterodoxy than the one that Sant'Anna presents. if the colleagues from Santana will allow me that observation. So you were somebody who combined all of these things, these classical insights, these different heterodoxies and so on. And although that was something that happened in the early days of the field that Luc and I were working in the 80s and the 90s, that's not something that's so common now. So it's quite extraordinary, and I appreciate that to a great extent. This was also obvious in the so-called reading group that you mentioned in your acknowledgements. This was a group in which PhD students and more senior scholars would debate all kinds of literature. You came up, all of us, we came up with topics. But the topic you came up with, at least one of them that I remember, was this debate between Freeman and Luc on the one hand, and Gerard Mensch on the other side, which was a debate in the 1980s, which was very interesting, but again, paying attention to the traditions of this field. Now, that debate, I remember, the session was very lively. It was also on Zoom, I think. But what was interesting there was that for the first time in about 10 years, I had ordered a book on interlibrary loan for that session, because usually the literature that we were discussing there was in the journals. We could all have electronic copies. Here we had to go and use this tool of interlibrary loan to get some of the books that we wanted to discuss. In fact, I think that you were the only scholar, at least since Alessandro and Under were PhD students who came. You were the only scholar since them who came into my office to borrow books. No. Not many people do that these days. You do. And I think this again shows the kind of tradition that you work in. I want to maybe conclude by remembering the last book that you borrowed from my office. Can you hold it up, or at least a copy of it?
Well.
Yes. It was not his book that he borrowed, but he borrowed a book called Problems of Capital Formation in Underdeveloped Countries by Ragnar Nurske. This was a book published in 1960, one of the classics of development economics, and it looked exactly like the cover of Oriol's thesis, except that it had a different title and a different author. So this is for all those people who did not recognize the cover and who wondered about it. That's where it comes from. It's a subtle reference to that whole field, to that whole set of literature that is there and that Oriol knows very well, and that he used for a thesis. So I appreciate that a great deal. I think it's extraordinary that you did that. I appreciate it. I think all the people here appreciated it. And I hope and I think, I'm confident that that's the way that you will continue your career. You're now at WIPO, doing different things, I imagine, than the ones that you've been doing for the thesis. But I'm sure that the sort of things that you will be doing in your career that you have ahead of yourself, you will be referring back to all of those traditions that you've already done. You will discover more, and that will make it a continuation of a very interesting journey. I congratulate you on that. I want to thank you for being a small part of that, and I hope you will prosper doing it in the rest of your career.
Thank you.
Dear Dr. Gisbert Marti, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I congratulate you, your family and friends with the degree you have acquired, and I would like to thank the members of the degree committee for their contribution to do so. We will, before closing this session, I would like to give the two members of the degree committee online an opportunity to congratulate you, because now they have this opportunity. And then we will take some pictures, and we can have the two of them also on the background if we take these pictures. And then mostly we take pictures on the stairs and in the large hallway. And to your family and colleagues and friends, I would say please go already to the Refter where there's a reception so you can wait with a drink, and we'll make sure that he will show up in a few minutes. With this, I can close this session conditionally, meaning that first we get the congratulations of the two other members of the degree committee.
The Oriol, congratulations. I will follow up on Bart, and I was pleased to see this trajectory combining different tradition in economics. So I think it was a nice journey for you. And let me say that what is refreshing is that there is this, that your enthusiasm for this old tradition and heterodox tradition in economics is not really for an antiquarian interest, but in the thesis it shows that it can provide insights, important insights still. So I second Bart wishes that you will continue in this type of intellectual journey. So good luck congratulations for the PhD today, and good luck for your future work.
Oriol, it's nice to see you in a different context. Usually lately when I've only seen you when I've been walking into the building and you've been standing in front of the building relieving one of your addictions. So it's nice to see you here instead of there. Not that I disliked seeing you there. It was always pleasant to stop and chat for a few minutes. And let me repeat what I said earlier, which is that I appreciate very much the lightness of your writing style. I think that's unusual in our business, that people are able to say things seriously, but in a way that isn't somber. So keep that up if you possibly can. You may have that whipped out of you while writing reports for WIPO, but try and sneak in a little bit of that if you possibly can. It makes life a lot easier for the reader. Anyway, well done, Oriol. I think you've done a great job. It's been really nice having you around as a PhD student. And I wish you all the best in your career in the future.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. With this, I close this session.
Okay. Stop. Yes, of course.
Okay, very good. One is already left.
Can start the first.
You will stand next to him. Bring the
That's for them.